I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we discuss the latest news from Ukraine, analyse the Russian Victory Day parade from Moscow, and talk to our economics reporter about the Russian economy, which still teeters on the brink of default.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, I sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Monday, the 9th of May, day 75. And today, I'm joined by Defence and Security Editor Dominic Nicholls, Deputy Foreign Editor Theo Merz, and our economics reporter, Louis Ashworth. I started by asking Theo for his reaction to this morning's victory parade in Moscow. Dom Nicholls was away from the office for most of today, trading the corridors of power in Westminster, so he could only join us briefly at the beginning of the podcast.
Well, Dom and I were watching the parades all the way through this morning, and the thing of note is that there wasn't a mobilisation or there wasn't a change in the course of the war that we saw from Putin's speech on Red Square, which is something that some analysts had thought might have happened, that he might have made some big tactical announcement. But what actually happened in the end is what tends to happen on Victory Day. He talked about Russia's victory over the Nazis and drew parallels with fighting in the present day, or with Russia's battles in the present day, whether that's with a hostile West or in Ukraine. What was noticeable from what he said this time was that the real emphasis on the current fighting, aggression from NATO. Russia, he said, had entered into talks with the West in good faith, and it hadn't been properly listened to. And he repeated what he's been saying all along, that this was a forced move, or Russia didn't want to do this, but it was forced into it by the West. So nothing surprising, but just really notable that he was there at this event ostensibly to mark victory over Nazism. There are still veterans of the Red Army, the Soviet Army alive who were there, who he did honour, and he did note their contribution to victory in 1945. But really, the emphasis was entirely on what is going on in Ukraine. And I think in terms of the military that we saw there, or perhaps the military that we didn't see there, it's best for Dom to speak on that.
Yeah, so we were expecting about a third down in terms of equipment numbers from last year. And I think that was very evident from the ground equipment, certainly. But also the air component of the parade was entirely absent. Now, we were told very shortly before the parade started, we were told that this was because of bad weather. The weather it was a bright day. There was some big puffy clouds, which might have been, I suppose you could say, there was a threat of a thunderstorm somewhere, which I know Air Force types don't like flying anywhere near. So, but yeah, possibly. But there is the speculation that actually the spectacle of a much reduced air fleet and what there would have been the old MiG-31s might not have looked good. So air component was completely absent. On the ground, there were very few vehicles. We saw the T-14 again. I don't know if we can keep calling it the new T-14, because we first saw it in 2015 at the Victory Day parade. But this is the next super duper tank from Russia. But it's never gone into mass production, so it might be the new tank, but it still isn't in regular service. So yeah, it's just the showroom model. I don't think we can start pointing at any great capability there. We also saw what else did we see? We saw some new unattended ground vehicles with weapons. Fine, some more experimental stuff. Not seeing them in service yet. Otherwise, it was just the usual thing. There was a small number of tanks, bit of air defence systems. I had the Yars intercontinental ballistic missile out again, but it was much reduced in number. I think there was only one of the T-14s, for example, and a handful of T-72 and T-90 variants. So markedly down on what we'd expect. normally in a normal year, and that's partly because of the numbers that have been sent to Ukraine, and partly because of the numbers that have not come back from Ukraine, not able to come back from Ukraine. But again, I mean, these things are taken to be partly celebrating the endeavours of the Second World War generation, and that's fine. That's to be applauded. Anyone who fights against Nazis gets my vote. But it's also to showcase up and coming equipment, new equipment, as I've just described. But of course, what it's completely it can't answer at the moment is that having the kit is just one thing. There's a whole range of stuff you've got to do to be able to fight it effectively. And the Russian army has shown itself to not be able to fight effectively in Ukraine. So you can trot out as many T-14 as you like, and as all the other new infantry fighting vehicles and what have you, and these robotics, and that's great. But I'm not going to forgive me if I'm not going to quake in my boots and say, gosh, what an amazing military the Russians have. I'll pause there on the equipment. There was some other. I was engaging. Theo and I engaging in sort of amateur Kremlinology this morning. There's some other bits and pieces I think of note on that, but I'll take a pause there.
Thanks very much, Dom. Theo, what else has been, away from the victory parade and back to the battlefront in Ukraine, what's been happening over the past few days that our listeners should be aware of?
Well, there was a strike on a school yesterday in which we think 60 people might have been killed. There's battles still ongoing there. The Azovstal plant that we were talking about a lot last week in Mariupol, this last holdout has yet to fully fall, so which is really quite incredible. And also for the Ukrainian side celebrate this victory day as well, because it's a Soviet victory on May the 9th. It's celebrated all across the former Soviet Union. So we saw a Victory Day speech from Zelensky yesterday, and more comments on this today. And it was really noticeable how the contrast between his speech and Putin's, in that he came out in a black t-shirt speaking or imposed in front of a bombed out building, and comparing the Russians to Nazis. Putin, of course, is saying that he's fighting Nazis in Ukraine, but Zelensky saying that we have survived this type of aggression before, and we will do again. So both of them really explicitly evoking memories and the losses of the Second World War to get their case. And it's been really interesting yesterday and today just to see how much history from that period is shaping this conflict now, and how they're both Zelensky and Putin are both using this to bolster their own narratives, or at least Zelensky is telling Putin that he doesn't have a monopoly on Soviet history, and reminding Ukrainians and the world how much Ukraine suffered under this occupation and is suffering now.
Thanks, Theo. Could you tell us a little bit about Patron? This is the famous Ukraine's famous mine-sniffing dog who was honoured yesterday during Justin Trudeau's visit to Ukraine. How did he get so famous? What does he do?
Oh yeah, this is fun. The Telegraph wrote about him a few weeks ago, I think in mid-April, that he is a mine-sniffing dog. So huge amounts. There's huge amounts of Ukraine that has been mined now. I can't remember the exact figure because this was a while ago, but the UN, I think, said that around a third of the country would have to be checked for mines once the war is over. And our correspondents have already been out with people clearing mines and clearing weaponry out of civilian areas. That cleanup is already happening outside Kiev. But Patron, this dog, has been part of the rescue efforts and has been written about in the international media. And then he was awarded for his canine bravery yesterday, as he saved by Zelensky. So that is a rare moment of levity, I suppose, joy in this conflict. And that is something that Ukraine does very well, seizing on those moments that can sort of I suppose cut through all the terrible and horrific news that we are hearing from this conflict.
Thanks, Theo. Is there anything else that's happened over the weekend and this morning that you think would be useful for us to know?
I think also these comments from Dom would be better placed to speak on this, but I think he has dropped off the conversation. These comments from Ben Wallace, our Defence Secretary, that not play into but reflect these conversations around the Second World War. He was saying that he was comparing Putin's actions to Nazism and calling for the Putin regime to suffer ultimately the same fate as Nazism. The humiliating defeat that they, or sort of definitive defeat that they did suffer. And those were comments yesterday, and today he was saying that Putin is living in a fairy tale with this narrative of the Second World War and comparing the fight in Donbass now to the wider Ukraine to the fight against the Nazis. So those comments are probably worth mentioning as well.
Thanks very much, Theo. At this point, I'd like to invite our economics reporter, Louis Ashworth, into the conversation. Louis, you've written a fascinating piece on how Russia is still teetering on the edge of default. We know that it's narrowly swerved, tumbling into its first international default in a century last week, but you think it's still in huge trouble. Can you tell us why?
Yeah, so as you discussed last week with my colleague Louise, there was this sort of looming Russian default that we thought might happen that week. It was averted in the case. Russia sort of tapped up its sort of limited domestic funds in order to make two payments that it had to make on overdue bonds. So it was able to avoid it in that instance. But what's kind of happened here is that we've just sort of delayed what might now look inevitable. I think the wide view, speaking to analysts and looking at the sort of the dynamics that we've seen develop in this kind of financial war that the West has launched against Russia, is that it's really a matter of if not when with a default. So the kind of crucial thing to understand here is, and this is something that was obviously emphasized a lot when the conflict first began, is Vladimir Putin has spent a lot of time getting Russia onto a war footing from an economic perspective. So one of the most important things about that is Russia is, from a fiscal perspective, an extremely solid economy, especially for an economy of the kind of size it is. I mean, often, Russia is in a category you would describe it as emerging markets if you were sort of a sort of markets covering person. Several other countries that are in that category have persistent issues with debt. They have very unstable economies. They have persistent problems with their currencies. These aren't really issues for Russia. Russia has been very fiscally conservative. It's been very controlled in the way that it's borrowed and spent money on a government level over recent years, and especially sort of over the past sort of 2 decades since Putin came to power. And it's very healthy in the sense that it has such large incomes from oil and gas that it's able to have that sort of excellent surplus in its current account that creates this big sort of stability. So the thing to understand from that is that Russia, although it's lost access to a lot of its foreign exchange stockpile, so it came into this war with about $640 billion worth of assets that included foreign currencies and gold. About half of that was frozen by the West when the war first started, in what was a sort of huge, unprecedented move, and is very important for understanding some of the wider economic context here. But there is still quite a lot of money left, and Russia's debts are not that big. So on a sort of functional level, Russia is capable of making these payments. Where this becomes so interesting is that the actual real decider here is a thing called the Office for Foreign Asset Control, which is part of the US Treasury. So what the Office for Foreign Asset Control does basically is when the US introduces sanctions of any kind, I mean, obviously, there are plenty of sanctions on Russia, but the US has various financial sanctions on people all across the world. The Office for Asset Control is the one that kind of enforces them, monitors them, comes up with new ones. They, at present, have a system in place whereby foreign holders of Russian debt can continue to receive payments on that debt until the 25th of May. So the crucial thing that's coming up now is Russia is due to make another tranche of payments on its international debts on the 27th of May. But 2 days before that, this allowance from the Office for Foreign Asset Control to let them make payments may lapse. So it's created a very weird situation, because essentially, if OFAC, this organisation, decides to drop the exemption and ban bondholders from receiving money from Russia, Russia will automatically default. There will be no functional way that Moscow can make those payments to their international bondholders. They will then be considered to have defaulted on those bonds, and they're within a state of default. So it's created a very, very sort of weird situation. I was speaking to some emerging market analysts last week and economists who are basically saying the situation from here is, does there reach a point where Joe Biden's White House says, you know what, it's more important for us that Russia defaults than it is that these bondholders get these payments. And at that point, will they just say, nope, cut them off, disallow the payments, and Russia will fall into default? So that's why we're still on the kind of cusp here, and it's why, despite last week, things are still very much in the air over this.
I mean, that's absolutely fascinating. So they, as you've written, they are sort of at the mercy of a wing of the US Treasury. I mean, I'd be interested to hear Theo's take on this as well. How does Russia, and you, of course, Louis, as well, how does Russia extricate itself from this position, or is it at this point just not possible to?
In a sense, it's impossible. Now, this is because one thing that this conflict has really emphasized and driven home is just how dominant the dollar is in terms of the international financial system. I mean, we hear a lot of talk, especially recently, with these ideas of sort of financial balkanization, that we could see, China, Russia begin to sort of hew themselves off from the international financial system and create their own systems. That may be something that happens, and clearly this war has in some ways accelerated that process that was already occurring to some extent. But for now, the dollar rules the world. The dollar is so integral to so many elements of the financial system that if you control the dollar, which of course if you're the United States you have the great fortune of doing, you really can control a huge amount of what is possible. And in this instance, it basically means that the US can, if it wants to, engineer what you could describe as an artificial default, and there's not really anything that Russia can do about it. Now, that is itself an interesting thing, because defaults have to be understood on sort of two levels. You have both the technical level of a country being put in default, which might which has its own effects, and then you have the reputation side of it. So on the technical side, what will occur is there'll be lots of asset managers, banks, maybe funds that will say to their clients, we are a reliable, dependable bank. We are one of Wall Street's biggest banks, and we only buy foreign debt if it's of a certain rating. We won't buy foreign debt that's not going to pay through. And this is all part of a sort of complicated process of how sort of funds are built and how assets are managed. If Russia goes into default and is deemed to have defaulted by international ratings agencies like Moody's, like S&P Global, there will be lots of these companies that manage huge amounts of money that will not be allowed to invest in Russia anymore. That will simply be against the terms that they've agreed with their investors, or their own sort of compliance terms. And it will become impossible. That obviously, as we discussed earlier, that may not matter that much for the Russian government, because the Russian government doesn't need foreign debt that much. If there is a spillover in which a country, you have a company that, say, has a rule that says, okay, if Russia is in default, we also can't buy any bonds belonging to any Russian companies, then you get a severe impact, because Russian companies are very reliant on international markets for funding. And if they lose that access, it could potentially be very damaging. Now, that's sort of the technical side of it. The reputational side is another interesting one, because it sort of cuts in two ways, interestingly. The first one being that, of course, Russia is, this is something that an investor said to me last week. It's a pariah. I mean, Russia has been hugely cut out of the Western financial system, and it is, its reputation could not be lower as a country that is sort of respectable, is true to its word, is a reliable, is sort of a reliable partner in that sense. So that's sort of important, but also not important, because defaulting your debts isn't going to make anyone think like, oh, that's the final straw. I was fine with all the other stuff that happened, but now they're defaulting on their debts. That truly is reprehensible. Clearly, that impact is also going to be lessened quite a lot by the fact that this default looks like it will be artificial when it occurs. People may argue, and I'm certain Russia will argue, that they've made their best efforts to make these payments, and therefore the default can't be considered to be sort of a real default, if that makes sense. And that, I'm sure, that's an argument they'll make as they attempt to sort of rebuild their reputation on international markets as and when we're past this conflict. The other side of it is there may be quite a lot of keenness from international markets to rehabilitate Russia, because, as I said earlier on, Russia has been a fiscally well-managed economy. It rakes in huge amounts of money through oil and gas sales. Obviously, there's a whole other question there about how long it's going to be able to continue to do that if there is a genuine concerted effort for the West to wean itself off those energy supplies. But there will be elements of the overseas investment market that will be very keen when they can to start buying Russian debt again, because Russia is a reliable payer of its debt, and it will be interesting to see what impact that dynamic has. I'm certain there will be stories in the sort of coming years of people who will be very keen to get back into buying Russian debt, and I imagine that will become a very interesting issue from a kind of sort of ethics and perception perspective, because it's likely to be considered, don't touch the Russian debt. Russia needs to be a pariah for a while longer. But if there's a dollar to be made, people will be trying to make it.
So, if Russia does default, what could we sort of look forward a little bit and ask you what does that actually look like on the ground? What starts to happen? How does the economy start to implode? How would it actually go down, in real time?
After a default begins, typically countries will then go, and the usual process is they will go to the IMF. They will try and come up with some kind of process to restructure their debt. They will normally do so in exchange for an agreement to institute a bunch of different policies. Typically speaking, these have been austerity policies in various countries in the past. In Russia, I think we're going to see something different, because Russia is so sort of disconnected now. I'm sure it won't want to work with the IMF, and also it won't need to restructure its debt in the same way, because it doesn't have the huge amounts of debt. It's not a sort of Argentina type situation in which it genuinely can't pay. It's that it will have been rendered unable to pay. So the bigger impact further down the line will be when Russia, and potentially as a consequence, Russia's corporations go to borrow in the future. They will meet a very hostile market. They'll meet a market that demands a very higher because of the nature of debt borrowing. You essentially you give someone money in exchange on the agreement they will pay you back a certain amount. The amount that people will ask for back will be higher, will be much higher as a result of this conflict. Investors will come to Russia and say, I need serious guarantees, or I need sort of something very, very good to sweeten this deal. Otherwise, I'm not going to lend you money because you're unreliable, because it's a reputational risk to my company. For those sort of reasons, they will want a lot more sort of bang for their buck. That then feeds through into everything. As soon as that kind of borrowing becomes more expensive, you'll begin to see borrowing fall, therefore investment falls, therefore growth falls. Tim Ash, who's a very smart sort of emerging market strategist at Blue Bay Asset Management, said to me that there'd be a very long-term impact of higher borrowing costs, lower investment, lower growth, lower living standards, probably for a good 5 to 10 years if Russia went into default. So that's the kind of idea of the sort of scope we're looking at. Is maybe a sort of a very difficult kind of decade in which the cost of doing business in Russia goes up. And we have to bear in mind that Russia is already experiencing severe inflationary pressures. I mean, inflation obviously is very high everywhere at the moment, but in Russia it's at nearly 20%, which is, you're hitting the kind of levels there where civil unrest, etc., can't be ruled out. I mean, obviously this kind of how people react to these kind of things is very idiosyncratic to different societies. And some countries you get incredibly high inflation and the government's overthrown. In Russia, it may be an entirely different situation. But that's the kind of thing we're looking at. It's that sort of long-term pain that Russia is going to experience. And the actual process of just being rehabilitated onto global debt markets might be sort of up to, I think typically about 3 years is about how long it takes before you can even begin to tap those markets again. Russia, as I said, maybe a little bit quicker because people will be so keen to lend them money potentially. But we're looking at up to sort of a potentially miserable decade for Russian companies and the Russian economy if they lose access to this stuff.
Theo, you've been listening. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on any of this.
Yeah, I was thinking it's so great to hear all of that and that detailed economic analysis because I know we were talking about how sanctions were affecting the Russian economy at the start of the conflict when they were first brought in, but in the foreign section, I know you've been doing this in business, but in terms of foreign news, we haven't been focusing on that so much and haven't been focusing on the impacts on ordinary Russians. So it's great to hear about that. And I was thinking about what you were saying about sort of how Russia might react to this and whether there might be civil unrest and whether this does actually pose a sort of existential problem to the Putin regime. You're talking about the idiosyncrasies between different countries. I think in Russia it's much less likely that there would be political uprising than elsewhere, but precisely because of the measures that Putin has been taking over the last decade, this real crackdown on civil society. As we know, Alexei Navalny, the most prominent opposition politician in Russia, has been jailed, and then at the grassroots, really sort of small and seemingly insignificant organisations across Russia has been targeted, so that there's no obvious organisation that can organise that can sort of rally people onto the streets, even if inflation is going up at this incredible rate and living standards are going down. So it is hard to see how that would happen. Also today, Putin was talking a lot, as he always does on Victory Day, about the Russian or the Soviet national psyche and how victory is part of that, and how sort of the way Russian society has been shaped in part by that victory over Nazi Germany. But also the national psyche, if there is such a thing, has been shaped by economic collapse after economic collapse or hardship. We saw most people, I think, most people, I'm not sure of the exact demographic breakdown in Russia now, but millions of Russians will remember the complete economic collapse following the breakup of the Soviet Union, default in 1998 as well. And then more recently, the sanctions that were brought in over Crimea and waves of sanctions since then. So it's not that even before these latest round of sanctions and this threat of default that you talk about, it's not that the economy was in a wonderful situation before, and it's not that, and living standards were going down. There was a squeeze on disposable incomes and a squeeze on the middle classes, and that did not really translate into a visible or organised movement against the Putin regime. So I think in terms of threats to the Kremlin that this might cause, I think it's much more likely to be something from inside the Russian elite, that they decide that Putin has become too much of a liability or that he is taking them in the wrong direction, rather than the grassroots protests that we might see elsewhere.
And Theo, just on that, I mean, I know from your work covering Russia for years and speaking Russian, you've seen a lot of these parades. How did this year's one What did it look like in comparison to the other years? Did you pick up on anything that was especially different or stood out?
It's hard to tell, not being in Moscow now. It's hard to get the feeling from the ground, and unfortunately, like a lot of Western media now, we don't have our own permanent correspondent there for security reasons. I did call a couple of friends in Moscow this morning just to say how strange this is all happening, and talk about the news and sort of ask them what the mood is there. And they are not Putin supporters. They're not. They're in a minority apparently in Russia, if we're to believe opinion polls from there. But they were both sort of so depressed by what is happening, and one of them said, it really feels like I'm in the USSR. And even though they're not Putin supporters, and even though they're not sort of they're no fans of sort of Russian military might, they tend, like most Russians, to have a good time on Victory Day, because it's still a public holiday. Even if you don't watch the parade, even if you don't see Putin's speech on TV, you still have the day off work. You'll still probably go out drinking with your friends in the afternoon and maybe watch the fireworks in the evening. But at least from amongst opposition-minded Muscovites, of which there are many, even if you aren't really able to see that from the Russian media, it's a very depressing and a very worrying time. I mean, from what we see on TV, it's similar to every year. As Dom was saying earlier, fewer tanks, less equipment on display. But in terms of what Putin is saying, the soldiers that we're seeing, it looks like it is like it has been for the last few years, and it's hard to tell. It's hard to tell from the outside what the mood on the ground is. Though we actually should be getting some reporting on that later.
Thanks, Theo. Louis, you've spoken a lot and in great detail, and I think we're hugely appreciative for that, on the Russian economy and the impacts on the Russian economy. But of course, the war is having a huge impact also on the Ukrainian economy. But obviously, the country is in a slightly different position, backed by many Western powers. So can you just talk us through how the war has impacted the economy and what its prospects are for the next few months and years?
Sure, of course, yeah. And actually, one interesting thing that's come on actually just whilst we've been discussing on the Russian front is Bloomberg's just been reporting on some leaked estimates for the damage that's being done to the Russian economy. Apparently, Russia's finance ministry thinks it may be a hit of up to 12% of its GDP, which would be it would make it the worst year in about 3 decades for the Russian economy. So it'd be very interesting to see how things play out on that front. Clearly, a severe hit is occurring. 12% is staggeringly huge, but we'll have to see. Yes, on the Ukraine front, there's sort of 2 main questions for Ukraine, one of which is less important than the other. The questions are over the damage and the default. So I'll actually maybe dispatch the default more quickly because it's probably the smaller issue. Now, Ukraine has had total foreign debts of about $130 billion at the end of last year. It had been expected to repay about $14 billion in debt this year. Clearly, that is not going to happen. Ukraine does not have the capacity right now to be paying off debts to foreign bondholders, and it's pretty likely that at some point during this year it will default. It owes money as well as to some international investors. It owes about $8.4 billion to the World Bank, 17 billion from the IMF, 13 billion euros from the European Commission. So it owes money to a lot of sort of major Western institutions. The crucial thing on that front is that clearly Ukraine has the faith and support of the West to a large extent. Now, maybe not as much as you might hope. Now, we saw a lot of money, especially in the run up to the invasion and directly afterwards, being sent to Ukraine. A lot of that, may have seemed like, they're being invaded, send them money, send them support. It was actually a little bit more mercenary than that. There were strings attached to quite a few of particularly the early tranches of money that were being sent there. The money that was being sent directly just as funding rather than sort of in some other aid form. So, for instance, the European Union sent Ukraine several billion euros just ahead of the invasion, and there were strings attached. They said that it needed to be repaid with interest, and also that Ukraine had to make certain policy changes. These can vary. Almost always, policy changes involve inflicting some kind of fiscal austerity on a society. That tends to be what lenders ask for in exchange for their money is some kind of guarantee that the economy is going to be reorientated in a way that makes them more likely to receive their payouts. The great tragedy of that basically is that almost always ends up meaning that the poorest people in society are those who are most punished. So yeah, large debts in Ukraine, lots of money to repay, some not hugely favourable conditions for the money that they've borrowed. They probably will default. Whether that matters that much it's a pretty academic point. The default will trigger some of those sort of technical processes that I spoke about with Russia earlier. I mean, there will be some people who will be, because of the rules of investment that they play by, will be banned from investing in Ukraine one way or another, or from buying Ukrainian debt as a result of a default. But I suspect there will be a widespread willingness to kind of wipe the slate clean and basically, be practical about it. The Western financial institutions will recognise that Ukraine would not have been able to make these payments, and will, I would imagine, be very forgiving over these debts. So it may be that either there's a default, and in kind of a similar way to how the Russian one may be sort of thought of differently, the Ukrainian one may not be thought of as a default at all. In terms of how big international institutions organise it, then it may be that some other sort of Western asset managers create some kind of Ukraine exemption. So we'll kind of have to see how that will play out. But I think there'll be a lot of willingness to very quickly rehabilitate Ukraine, and it's not your fault kind of attitude will be taken on it. That being said, I mean, I spoke earlier about how when a huge important part of this is the financial motivations of the different parties involved, and in the aftermath of this conflict, the fact will be that in a horribly cynical, jaded way, that is the way that financial markets often work, Russia will still be a better place to lend money to than Ukraine, almost certainly, because Ukraine's economy, for all the help the West might give it, is still going to have big long-term structural issues. And it may well be that the amount of support they get from the West is not sufficient to sort of suddenly make them. They're not going to suddenly become a great creditor overnight because they are a great borrower overnight because they have received all this Western support. They're still going to have problems. Whereas on the flip side, Russia is still going to be probably a country that runs an excellent current account surplus and is able to make good on its payments. So an odd dynamic there. And again, I think we're going to see some sort of there's going to be some clashes on an ethical front. I'm quite sure that will come up in the coming years. So that's sort of the default side of it, which in a sense, it's still interesting, but it's kind of sort of academic in a kind of similar way to the Russian one. The bigger side is the sort of damage side of it. Now, the Kiev School of Economics has been throughout this conflict trying to sort of put a tag on how much damage has been done. I know Giles was speaking earlier about over the weekend another school was destroyed. I mean, they have tried to calculate the total damage. I mean, the numbers are just extraordinary. I mean, they say damage to infrastructure in Ukraine is at about $92 billion, of which 4.5 billion was in the last week alone, and the total economic losses are at somewhere up to or even above $600 billion. So that's nearly 200 factories and enterprises have been destroyed, about 231 hospitals, hundreds of schools, in fact, thousands of schools, hundreds of bridges, churches, cultural buildings. I mean, one figure they've got here is that 23.8 thousand kilometers of roads have been damaged and 33.7 million square meters of housing stock. So this is huge. I mean, this is long-term damage that is extremely hard to, extremely expensive to right. On top of everything, at a time where, because of global prices, it's extremely expensive to do any kind of infrastructure work. So pain on two fronts there for Ukraine, and there's a huge question over who's going to fund this now. Who's going to fund sort of fixing these issues? One that's been discussed a lot is, I mentioned earlier, this sort of Russian foreign war chest of about $640 billion worth of foreign currency and gold, about half of which has been frozen by the West because it's in Western accounts. There is a growing call to seize that money and channel it into Ukraine to try and fix this. Now, it's a testament to how much damage has been done that will only cover maybe half of the damage that's been estimated here. But there's clearly some impetus behind this idea. Joseph Borrell, who's the EU's High Representative for Foreign Policy, was speaking to the Financial Times just today, and has said, he'd be very much in favour of using these frozen funds to help Ukraine rebuild. And there's a precedent for this. We've seen similar things happen in the past with foreign assets held by Iran and Iraq and Afghanistan. I think as recently as last year, I believe, the US seized Afghani foreign assets after the Taliban took over and used them elsewhere. I mean, Borrell again said, we have the money in our pockets, and someone has to explain to me why it is good for the Afghan money and not good for the Russian money. It's something that Brussels has looked at. Certainly, there's been some investigation of whether it's possible to use reserves. As things stand so far, we haven't actually heard any solid policy. There are several ways that could work. It might be that the money's made into a kind of pool for loans that Ukraine can then borrow from at very favourable rates. It might be pumped into Ukraine immediately as a grant. I doubt it would be the latter one because, as I said, Ukraine, countries will be very hesitant to just pump money into Ukraine. There will be a lot of hesitancy to do that, especially at a time where a lot of countries are facing their own domestic economic pressures. So a lot of questions over what happens there, but there's definitely some sort of growing drive to use some of Russia's war chest for Ukraine, which obviously has a kind of there's a poetic justice to that, I suppose.
Thanks, Louis. Just because we're coming towards the end of our time, I think, could you just lay this all out in the next few weeks? What should we expect from in the economic sphere of this conflict, just in general? What are the big things our listeners should be looking out for? What's coming down the track?
Sure. So obviously, any prediction is going to be hugely contingent on what actually happens with the conflict. I know that there were obviously we thought this conflict would be very short. There were times where we thought maybe it would be over by today because of the symbolism of Russia wanting some kind of objective before this big sort of commemoration of the Second World War. A lot could change depending on what does and doesn't happen with the war. And I think discussions about rebuilding Ukraine, rehabilitating Ukraine will not take place. They're taking place clearly, but they probably won't develop into substantial policy until we have a clearer sense of what the end game is for Russia's invasion. So probably, I would say, going back to the beginning of our discussion, the big things to look out for might well be whether we're going to have this engineered default. So we might start to get signals from the US Treasury, from the White House, from US officials on whether they believe they will extend that exemption from the Office of Foreign Asset Control. As I said earlier, it's going to lapse on May the 25th, at which point Russia will basically be tipped into a sort of default by default. It may be the case that the US determines at that point that is appropriate and that's what they want to happen, in which case we will sort of hear nothing, and then Russia will be unable to make its bonds. There'll be a grace period, and then probably in late June, Russia will default. we may hear something different. They may extend that exemption, and there may be an indication that the US is happy to see Russia, drain its reserves and continue making payments to the West. I think we'll get a sense of that in the coming weeks.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio, or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and today on Twitter, Alice Hearing.